Okay. Now we're recording. And just to, the people on the call already, we all have our mouths watering for this because it's an historic book that is part of a transformation of the mental health world, the world of how people look at mental health. And it's a paradigm shift that has been in the works for a while, but this book is really bringing it to the forefront of psychiatry and psychology. So there's 2 pages of praise for beyond diagnosis. When you get a hold of the book, they're just beautiful. Doctors, it looks like most of them are doctors, MDs or PhDs. It's a wonderful thing. So thank you all for joining us. And Wendy, you're going to start off with the foreword, right? And remember, you just start speaking because your square will be lit up. There's a green frame. If you don't know how that works, just start speaking. We'll see your frame because there's not too many people where we can't see people off on the side.
Yeah, right.
And
plus the audio will help if I'm looking at the book. All right, for those of you who've got the book, we're on the forward. And if you don't have the book, don't worry. It'll sink in. All right, beyond diagnosis sits between 2 worlds. The world of our current view of mental health and a world with the potential for a very different reality of mental well-being. You're probably more familiar with the world associated with our current psychological understanding. In this world, our awareness around mental health is increasing. There are many approaches to try and help those suffering, but there haven't been any easy answers to these challenges. Mental health improvement seems to take a lot of work, and there's often no relief for those suffering. Even in the general population, happiness, contentment, and well-being are more of an exception than the norm. A different world is brought to life within this book. Through the stories of individuals and practicing professionals, a very different reality of psychological health emerges. This new world is radically different from the one most of us live in. Real mental health is available without extensive work, even in the face of diagnosed mental illnesses. In this new world, relief, happiness, and satisfying, joyful lives are all reasonable expectations for anyone, regardless of your previous experiences and diagnosis. It is a new reality based on a new understanding of the human potential for clarity and well-being. Anybody have a book they want to take it next?
The power of beyond diagnosis is that it demonstrates the potential for this new reality is not imaginary. It is real and available now. Chana Studley shows us that the potential for mental health and well-being is easier to access than we would imagine given our current understanding. This book is not a philosophical treatise or an ideological argument. It is simply the accounts of lives of real people in their own worlds. Some of these people have suffered diagnosed mental illness, and some are professionals that help those with these diagnoses. All of them are brought together by the experience that real psychological health and well-being are available to everyone in a way not previously thought possible, simply through a new understanding. Hannah skillfully outlines the way this new perspective allows for a change in our understanding, one that points to a single cause of mental illness and, for the first time, a cure. It is clear there is potential for a radical shift, a shift from the way we currently understand and approach mental illness. This book represents a turning point. It is a bold outline of a new potential for the relief of suffering, the establishment of well-being as a general norm, and more broadly, a radical shift in the field of psychiatry and psychology. As a professional who has been working in the field for many decades, seeing the kind of results you will read here, it is wonderful to see a book that highlights the kind of impact and understanding is having in the field of diagnosed mental illness.
Laura, you want to read?
I just wanted, I wanted to also mention, I forgot to say this. Person writing this forward is Aaron Turner. He is George Pransky's nephew, and also he was a researcher. He was a PhD, and his specialty was research. So this is very special that the forward is coming from somebody who's in the field and spent years in research. And I'll go from here. Most importantly, this book could be a turning point for you, the person reading it.
Good. 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 On a call, listening. I'm working. You're working. How's your day going?
I think somebody's coming through here.
I was in the pool.
Are you
but they
able
don't
to
have
mute
water. I
Liam?
home and shower.
Lori,
Wendy.
can you, no, you have to.
Oh, right. Okay. Hang on. And I will give you mute.
There you go.
Oops, I muted the wrong person.
No, you didn't. You did fine.
Oh, okay. And I'm gonna give you a co-host so that you can make co-host. If I'm reading, you can
Great.
work the wheels.
Okay.
Okay, here
All
we
right.
go.
Go ahead.
Most importantly, perhaps, this book could be a turning point for you, the person reading it. It's an opportunity for you to consider a new understanding of happiness and well-being. Let's consider this for a few moments. Behind the inspiring stories of personal recovery lies a simple yet comprehensive understanding of the mind that originated with the insights of a man named Sydney Banks. When I came across this understanding 35 years ago, the first generation of psychologists to discover its potential were already seeing groundbreaking results with their clients. They were also living and working at a new level of well-being themselves, rather than stressed and burned out. My uncle and aunt, George and Linda Pransky, ran one of these practices in the US, and I attended many trainings there. I saw for myself how fresh and content the psychologists were in their work and personal lives. I also saw how consistently happy and full of well-being their clients were to just a few days of getting help. You will notice a pattern within the stories. The key challenge for all of them was finding the willingness to take this new and radically different understanding seriously. The challenge was not the person's diagnosis, their past, their suffering, the difficulty of the work, or the therapy. The challenge was being open to something that flies in the face of what they think or have been told is true about themselves, their illness, their diagnosis, and their potential for mental health. Once they started to be open to what is being said, the stories flip and everything seems to magically change and improve.
All right. Who else has a book that can read? David, do you? Do you have a book?
You'd have to unmute though, David.
Yeah. Can you
Oh,
unmute it?
he's got
Can
it
you
on
unmute?
his.
Okay. Great. Oh, great. I've got it. Oh, great. Well, okay. Go ahead. Go for it.
Yeah, I got it on that before I got the book, so the book's packed. Right, okay. As the reader, I imagine this aspect of the stories, radical positive change with no process or explanation, might be curious to you. What did they do? How did it happen? My story is similar to those you will be reading. Coming across this understanding in my late teens, I intuitively rejected it as simplistic, unrealistic, even silly, basically unworthy of respect and consideration. But like the stories in the book, once I took an earnest interest, the shift was dramatic. It was like discovering a missing piece in my understanding of life. While on my PhD program, I was working a night shift at a hostel for homeless people diagnosed with schizophrenia. One of the residents had come into the office and was telling me his story. His story was similar to many within this book. A troubled teenager who had a psychotic episode was hospitalized and then spent the following 15 to 20 years in professional care. It was clear he had the assumption he was ill or broken in a real and life-determining way, and it was clear his mental health had deteriorated over the period he was in professional care. As he told me his story, I could see he had what I would call well-being. I could also see that he had no idea he had any potential for well-being. In his reality, he was only sick. That was real to him. In that moment, I saw several key things that have guided my work since. I saw he had a potential for clarity and well-being that he had not considered. You could see it in how he told his story. However, I could also see, given his assumptions about himself based on his own real-life experience of suffering, it would be very difficult for him to seriously consider he also had the potential for well-being.
Beautiful. I
Wait,
just
who else has
discovered
the book? Oh, go ahead, Lori.
I just discovered something that might be useful to all of us. I have closed captioning on my screen, and so I could see David reading and also the words right under. And that I like that rather than having my face in the book. So thought I'd pass that on. It's in the 3 dots on the bottom. You could get captioning too. So
Great. Oh, good idea.
anything you want to say, or who wants to read next?
I can read next.
Oh, great, Cynthia,
Thank you.
go.
It was obvious that he had that potential, but was not open to the idea he had it. It would be inaccessible to him no matter how real it was. In that moment, I realized we live in a world that overlooks this potential and suffers and struggles as a result. I decided in that moment to focus my work on raising awareness of this aspect of the mind, an aspect that seems so lost to us all and so difficult to seriously consider. Sitting in that little office with a resident of the hostel, it was obvious that the fundamental barrier to people and the wider world benefiting from our natural potential for mental health, clarity, and well-being was the fact that the understanding of it is in direct opposition to what we currently think and understand. The current understanding is well established, but is also intimately tied to the limits we face in trying to find more clarity and well-being. Chana's book addresses this key challenge, and I would love to have had this book that night. You might be wondering why Beyond Diagnosis has such a wide range of stories from so many practitioners, organizations, and their clients. The reason is people tend to resist and argue with this understanding. Once they get interested and start to see the validity of it, they start to see new things about their experience and are thrilled. Chana has made the validity of this understanding compelling, regardless of diagnosis and all other factors, to help you, the reader, be more open so you too can see something life-changing for yourself. To show this new potential is credible.
Beautiful, thank
Anybody
you.
else have a book? Anybody else have a book they can read? If not, I'll take it from here. Okay. Beyond Diagnosis is also packed full of accounts of psychologists, psychiatrists, and coaches who know their clients will find mental health and consistently see this purely by sharing this understanding. There seems to be no work, no intervention, and no willpower involved. The stories show a range of people of all ages with a wide variety of experiences from across the world who discovered an effortless potential for mental health and a life of possibilities and ease outside the limits of their diagnosis. These are all people who had suffered chronically and extremely with the idea that they were damaged or ill in a way that would likely be permanent and unresolvable. There are so many varied examples here, but yet they are so similar and consistent. This seemingly easy potential for mental health starts to feel normal and unremarkable. I want to interrupt myself in a way. My mother I was born in the month of June, and my mother was in a psychiatric hospital by the month of August. And she was in and out of psychiatric hospitals for most of my early years, from the time I was 2 months old until I was 3 or 4 years old. And I stayed with I, I I had three sisters who were 15, 16, and 17 when I was born, and my dad, he was working full time, taking care of three teenage girls and a newborn baby. One day he came home from the hospital without his wife and his newborn baby in the car, and he had to go to work the next day. So I was taken to a whatever, social worker placed me. I can't remember what these homes are called, whatever it's called. And then my father's sister took care of the baby, and my dad was 50, she was 62 when she took me as a newborn baby. And my mother at some point became more stabilized over 3 to 4 years. She wasn't in and out all the time. And then over the course of the next 10 or 12 years, she was in and out a fair amount, 2 or 3 times a year. She was gone. I'm just recognizing that she certainly felt broken. My father thought of her as broken.
Mm.
Her therapist thought of her as broken. And yeah, I guess I just wish this had been around a few decades ago so that I could have shared something. Well, somebody could have shared something different with Dorothy, my mom. So anyway, so with this wealth of real life examples, it might be easy to forget that most of us live without an awareness of this transcendent potential for well-being. Most of the professionals available to help the people suffering are not fully aware of this either. In most of the stories, the professional working with the person telling the story had never encountered a client whose mental illness had disappeared, let alone disappeared without intense treatment. This potential for a new reality of mental health for us is all radical, yet tangible. It is the potential for this shift that highlights how profoundly important these stories are. I am thrilled that Hannah has written this book. The stories are touching and compelling. However, I know from my own experience working with others that you, the reader, are the only person that can read this book with an open mind and curious mind. No matter how much evidence Hannah assembles, if you want to argue and dismiss what's being presented, you can. As preparation for reading this book and getting some benefit from it, I would encourage you to read it with an open and curious mind. Lori, why don't you close it out for us?
Yeah, sure. I just also wanted to say, Wendy, thank you so much for sharing your story. I mean, that really touched me. It's almost like, I don't know, the sacrificial lambs, right? That the people who had a sacrifice. And it was so innocent because psychiatrists and psychologists and mental health workers were in the field because they wanted to help people. And so I just feel so much gratitude that we're at this point in the evolution of humanity. That's just very touching to me. So I'll try to
Well,
read.
If you want me to poke the bear a little bit,
Yes.
my mother had, I have no idea how many electroshock therapy treatments. And I have no idea how many of those electroshock therapy treatments my 15, 16, and 17-year-old sisters, were sitting by her bedside when she woke up holding her hand.
Oh.
The trauma was big and wide in my family from witnessing such things. So I am very, very grateful for this new day. Very, very grateful. Yeah.
And no surprise that you're a nurse, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Okay, onward. My final thought on getting the most from this book is to relax and enjoy it. And I also wanted to add what Aaron Turner said about being open and curious. That's the key. You're going to run up against resistances because we've all had not the best experiences. So I don't want to say too much at this point, but the more open you can be to just considering what is being said here, and the stories are profound. And I met some of those people who I did not know before when I was in Viva. You would never in a million years know that it was the same person, but there were also people at Viva who could verify that yes, that was the person. And that was exactly, what their past was like. So transformation is absolutely possible. And I'm in the book. So I know from firsthand, that it's possible and probable, as long as you're open to possibility and seeing something new. So it contains everything you need. Chana has provided a carefully put together orientation in a rich and comprehensive range of stories. Reading them, I could feel the energy and personalities of the storytellers come off the page as I experienced their journeys of struggle, learning, and discovery. The patterns they share effortlessly and intuitively coalesced in my mind, and I felt I learned as I read. This is a pivotal book. Chana has gathered a wealth of evidence that demonstrates a consistent impact from learning about what Sydney Banks called the three principles by doing this. Not only has she given you a chance to see this for yourself, but she has provided an opportunity for the wider world in the field of psychology and psychiatry to stop, take a step back, and take a new and fresh look at what this understanding has to offer. For myself, I'm eternally grateful to Sydney Banks, whose discoveries and guidance have enabled me to find the potential for a life of happiness, love, and contentment and connection beyond what I ever imagined possible, and an alternative to the increasing discomfort and anxiety I was living in and had assumed was inevitable. I can absolutely relate to that sentence. Without his discovery of the three principles, I likely would have lived my whole life without any idea that potential existed. Me too. Now that I know it is there, I want everyone to find it. I can't resist. Namaste is coming to me. Namaste, right? Which means that the God in me salutes the God in you. The essence of who we really are, right, is for all of us. Oh. Anybody want to share anything or comment, or before we go on to chapter 1, which is called
Yes.
Sad, Mad, or Bad?
David's got
Wendy.
something to say. David,
Yeah.
go ahead, David.
Thank you. I've been teaching a group at my church for a few months now, actually for about 2.5 years, based upon the renewing of the mind through the principles understanding. And young lady came three weeks ago. The best way to describe her is she looked a bit vacant, a bit lost, lonely, shabby, carrying lots of bags, a bit confused, probably late 30s. But I saw in her eyes something and she said, I've come to learn and I'm really excited about this. So I said to her, is there anything particular? And she said, yes, I have 2 recurring thoughts. One is that I want to kill myself, and the second is I want to hurt myself. Now, if I was running a therapy session, I would probably have to report that to a GP or the police because I know of a threat to life. It was a training, educational session I was running. I lent her Hannah's book, Beyond Diagnosis. She took it away for 2 weeks and came back Monday just gone. And at the end, and she looked different. And she came up to me at the end of the course and she said, at the end of that evening, and she said to me, those thoughts have nearly gone, David. Do you know? And you know, she said they're barely there. And you know what I'd said to her when she told me what those two thoughts were? I said, I think you'll find that those thoughts carry no more weight than if you told yourself you wanted a cat. And that is wisdom beyond the human system, isn't it? But what had happened is she'd realised that it's thought. So I just
Wow.
thought it's amazing turnaround.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. That's beautiful. I'm going to remember that. That thought carries no weight then. I think I'll get a cat.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. All right, David, if you're up for reading, we can start chapter 1.
Sure.
Sad,
Okay.
mad, or bad?
Out of bed. Right. On a recent trip to New York, I was sitting in the late summer sunshine outside a cafe in a Queens suburb with a dear friend and a new acquaintance she wanted me to meet. The new friend was a therapist, and so we instantly got to talking about the work we do. I have been coaching and counselling people with mental health issues for over 35 years, and am always surprised by how much misinformation is still out there. My friend, Tammy, was asking what effect antidepressants really have. I replied that research shows they are often not much better than placebos. At their best, they only blunt emotions, and at their worst, are highly addictive, with terrible side effects. They actually don't cure anything. They don't really know how the brain works, I said casually. Of course, they know. They're doctors. Scientists have been studying the brain forever. Karen, the therapist, smiled. She knew the truth. They really don't know. Did you know that the first antidepressants were made from rocket fuel? I added, it was made into a drug given to Parkinson's patients after the war. If I remember rightly, it was only by accident they found out that it temporarily helped to calm some people. But they still don't know exactly how. Tammy looked at me in disbelief. Suspecting there were more misunderstandings to dispel, I continued. And you know that, despite decades of extensive research, there is no evidence that any mental illness is the result of a chemical imbalance. It was only an idea and has never been proven. Tammy shook her head, but that was it. Now I was blowing her mind. Over to you.
Go for it, Elaine.
The information we have been presented about mental health and mental illness is not the whole story. So what we are missing and how that can help the millions of people who are suffering. I've wanted to write a book about this for years. Thank you to these friends for giving me the push to start. William James, the grandfather of American psychology, once said that all scientists have principles and put forward the idea that psychology also has its own set of principles. For the last 8 or 9 years of my coaching career, I've been working with people from a new paradigm in the psychology called the 3 principles. Since discovering these principles, I have personally met many people who, after years of searching and trying other treatments, have recovered from a wide range of diagnoses. For example, they have recovered from debilitating anxiety, suicidal ideation, even psychosis, and schizophrenia as a result of insights into these 3 principles. And when I say recovered, I mean fully. After being told they were either sad, mad, or bad, and would have to learn to cope with their torment for the rest of their lives, they are now living full, happy lives without the need for further therapy, treatment, or medication. It is their inspiring stories I've brought here to show you that there is always hope. Part 1 of this book is a short history of psychology, psychiatry, and the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I begin by questioning its fidelity, how it is that so many of these diagnoses have some symptoms. Where did the myth of chemical imbalance come from? And most important question, could there be one generic cause of mental illness? And if so, what is it? To answer this, I will introduce you to a paradigm shift in understanding how the mind really works and the fundamental principles of how all experience is created. Part 2 of this book is a collection of incredible and inspiring stories from people who have really fully recovered from a variety of psychiatric diagnosis. Each section starts with and have fully recovered from, each section starts with an interview with a psychiatrist or mental health professional who has decades of clinical experience. We will look at the myths and misunderstandings of some of the most well-known diagnoses, syndromes, and so-called diseases. In part 3, I interviewed Dr. Thomas Kelly, Professor Emeritus at Wayne State University, and author of over 40 published research papers about the impact of the 3 principles. You will also discover a selection of nonprofit organizations that are leading this way in our communities by bringing these principles into all areas of mental health services, in schools, prisons, and on the street. These pioneering advocates are helping transform suffering and mental distress into productive and joyful lives. My hope is that you will see something fresh and new, finding something helpful, and above all, be inspired by the innate resilience and courage of the human spirit that shows we can all survive and thrive against great odds and everyday challenges.
Thank
Wow.
you, Elaine.
Great,
I
great,
wonder
great.
if would you like to say anything, Joe? I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you could say anything about your background as far as working in very difficult mental health hospital settings. And here you
Well,
are.
mhm. I can start by saying that I am in the field because of my mother. My mother was also in and out of psychiatric hospitals, and as far as I can remember, it started at the age of 9. When I was in school, one of the things that I learned about was a life script. I am the life script, according to my mother. I am a mental health professional because of my mother's mental health illnesses. I wrote my thesis, my master thesis on psychopathology and psychiatry. And the reason why I did that is because I'm going to cry, because the whole concept of medication and therapy was very valid back then, but I had to push her to take her medication, and I hated every moment of it. Because I was the professional in the family, it was expected, and that I was the one who could talk to her and encourage her to do that. And she was on so many different medications, it just broke my heart.
Oh. Mm, mm.
So I am super, super grateful for this book, and I wish this book came out years ago because she could still be here today.
Yes. Yes, 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 yes. We hear you.
It's interesting that so many of us have had, my mother also, before I was born, had electric shock therapy.
Yes.
She said that was the closest she came with her mother, because her mother would bring her in the subway system to the hospital for her treatments. It was so accepted back then. And then I remember as a young child seeing some television movie, I think it was, and my mother had to turn the channel right away, and it had something to do with somebody getting electric shock therapy. I mean, that was so accepted in the 50s.
Yes.
And everybody was diagnosed with something back then. I mean, today too, it seems today we could say the same thing. And do you know, Elaine and everybody, I had a reoccurring dream. There was like this drawer that came out from underneath the cupboard in my kitchen growing up.
Mhm.
The drawer was filled with medications. those
Mhm.
orange bottles with the white tops. I had a
Yes.
reoccurring dream of my mother going into that drawer with all those bottles. Woo!
Yeah.
Again, you know, we have to remember it was so innocent. People, and sometimes it wasn't innocent. People were doing things for the almighty dollar.
Mhm.
But for the most part, I think people in the helping profession, they were there because they wanted to help. I mean,
Mhm.
no surprise that, who knows what Mary, the other nurse, what your background is. You don't have to share it, Mary, but there's a reason that we wind up in the field we wind up in, right?
Mhm. Yes.
Yep.
We see things that we want other people to not have to go through. So that was beautiful, Elaine. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Mm. All right, Cynthia, can you take us to chapter 2? There's some notes on the history of psychiatric diagnosis.
Right. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, or the DSM, is often regarded as the Bible of psychiatry. First published in 1952 with 60 diagnoses, it's now in its 5th edition and contains nearly 300 diagnoses. This massive dictionary of psychiatry is used by doctors, nurses, psychologists, and social workers, researchers, many others worldwide in the field of mental illness, sorry. I say mental illness with purpose, as the way it is currently being practiced, it is not a field of mental health. There have been several fantastic books written about the origins of the DSM and its development, so I won't go into its entire history. Instead, I want to share with you some of the highlights I found fascinating as I read and researched this huge compendium. And huge it is. Its cost, $188, is one of Amazon's best-selling books. My son actually bought that book, I would tell you. A book that is, that as author Dr. James Davies, associate professor at Roehampton University, reports, is often their #1 bestseller. To give you a sense of scale, writes Davies, the latest Harry Potter novel came in at 6, and 50 Shades of Grey was #9. So who on earth is buying this vast and pricey dictionary of distress? The first thing that struck me was that this respected and widely used reference book is not published by a government agency or even a university or a nonprofit, but by the American Psychiatric Society. What's wrong with that, you may ask? Well, the APA is a guild, an association of professionals, like a local association of, say, car dealers. Let's think about this for a moment.
Okay, I'll take it from here. Let's imagine, for example, the Southern California Automobile Dealers Association has a journal that it puts out a few times a year. Its members range from top manufacturers to local dealers. It has interviews with car designers and articles about the latest advances in anti-lock brakes and tinted windows. Who do you think gets to choose which articles go in and who pays the journalists? There are spaces for advertising. Who do you think will be able to afford the advertising rates? Joe Schmo's secondhand car deals in Bakersfield or the Mercedes-Benz dealership in Beverly Hills? Who's going to be able to attend the annual association meeting in San Diego? The Palm Springs BMW dealership can afford to send 2 or 3 delegates, whereas Joe Schmo can't leave his car lot unattended because he can't afford to miss a sale. Can you see the problem? Can you guess who's going to get elected to positions of influence and who's going to be sidelined and ignored? And so it is with the making of the DSM. My favorite, if not frightening, story about how the DSM-3 was compiled was a report from one of the doctors, Dr. Renee Garfinkel, who was present at a meeting about about which diagnosis should go into a particular category. You must understand, what I saw happening on those committees was not scientific. It was more resembled a group of friends trying to decide where to go for dinner. One person says, I feel like Chinese food. And another says, no, 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 I'm really more in the mood for Indian food. And finally, after some discussion and collaborative give and take, they all decide, let's go have Italian. Voting is not science, especially if the person with the loudest voice or the deepest pockets wins. But this is how the DSM came about. The
I'm
public
gonna-
could be excused.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, Wendy. This is fantastic.
Certainly.
Because it'll fit perfectly. I actually know a woman who was 7 years old when the DSM, the first DSM, was being created. She was present in her father, who was a psychiatrist, her father's dining room table with the other psychiatrists. She has an amazing story, and I'm going to invite her to join us. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just had to get that out.
Okay. Voting is not science, especially if the person with the loudest voice or the deepest pockets wins. But this is how the DSM came about. The public could be excused for thinking the DSM is based on research, and they'd be right to a certain extent, but very little of the extensive research that costs the American taxpayer millions annually actually proves the content of the DSM are true diseases. But let's go back to the 1800s and find out why the creation of a DSM was necessary. Journalist Nellie Bly, born Elizabeth Jane Cochran, May 5th, 1864, died January 27th, 1922, was asked by Joseph Pulitzer to go undercover for his newspaper, the New York World. Her assignment was to investigate the state of Blackwell Island Women's Lunatic Asylum by feigning madness. In her book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, she describes the horrific treatment she received there. What accepting torture would produce insanity quicker than this treatment? Here is a class of women sent to be cured. I would like the expert physicians who are condemning me for my action, which has proven their ability, to take a perfectly sane and healthy woman, shut her up, and make her sit from 6 a.m. till 8 p.m. on straight back benches. Do not allow her to talk or to move during these hours. Give her no reading and let her know nothing of the world or its doings. Give her bad food and harsh treatment and see how long it will take to make her insane. 2 months would make her a mental and physical wreck. Nellie's book set off investigations and government inquiries exposing the gruesome and degrading treatment of the inmates in those Victorian asylums. As her writing hints, many of the people there may not have been insane when they entered. Trauma, ill health, and poverty could probably explain most admissions, but were possibly rendered insane by their suffering and cruel treatment. Nellie writes, I left the insane ward with pleasure and regret. Pleasure, I was once more able to enjoy the free breath of heaven. Regret that I could have brought with me some of the unfortunate, that I could not have brought some of the unfortunate women who lived and suffered with me, and who, I'm convinced, are just as sane as I was and am now myself. Okay, Lori, over to you.
Hey, I'm gonna go back a few paragraphs where when Wendy read this, I had a look, like, is that really the name of this institution? It
Mhm.
is. It because the word lunatic is capitalized. I was thinking, is
Mhm.
that where did that word lunatic come from? Blackwell Island Women's Lunatic Asylum. That was the name of that place. Elaine, you're familiar with that? You knew that?
I'm familiar with the language because in the whole field of mental health back in the 1800s, it was called lunacy. Like all the women or men who were talking about unusual experiences, hallucinations, um, hallucinations, delusions. They're all. It's all about lunacy. So
That
many of the
interesting?
institutions had these names. This is the language that, the life of insanity. People were insane. So they called the asylums insane asylums. And they had all of these very, very negative, harsh, and cruel names.
Wasn't it something to do with the moon? Wasn't it lunar? It's the lunatic. It's a symptom of the moon, full moon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
They
That's not
had to blame it on something.
Not just like the person is going through a tough time. Let's see what's happening with them. Let's find out what's going on for them. Yeah.
Oh no, we'll blame the moon. Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Blame the moon. Okay. And there's the word in the very first place I'm reading here. I left the insane ward with pleasure and regret. Pleasure that I was once more able to enjoy the free breath of heaven. Regret that I could not have brought with me some of the unfortunate women who lived and suffered with me, and who I am convinced are just as sane as I was and am now myself. It is heartbreaking to read her account, but more so when we know that not much changed over the next 100 years as a result of her book. The asylums eventually emptied out and closed down for financial reasons, but change in how we understand mental illness has been even slower. From my personal experience, I remember visiting a school friend in the late 70s who had been admitted to Barrow Gurney Hospital, a state-run psychiatric hospital in the UK. It was an old Victorian institution, dark and eerie, isolated on the edge of a wooded area. I felt like we were entering the set of a horror movie, complete with barred windows and the stench of urine. Our friend had become very withdrawn. I didn't know all the details, maybe a suicide attempt, but the atmosphere there gave me nightmares. I remember feeling extremely uncomfortable and very grateful I was leaving in a few hours. Vacant, sedated, and unresponsive, Simone died in his early 20s. How many thousands of people have been locked away to perish in institutions like this when they could have otherwise been helped? Whew.
Can I
Somebody
just
want to go next?
Can I just share a
David?
quick experience, if you don't mind? In the 1970s, I had two experiences of serious mental institutions. My first wife lived with her family opposite a place called Worley Hospital, which was and literally there was a constant row of old men and women in their night clothes, just dragging themselves along the pavement, up and down. They just wandered around in their night clothes, in their robes, and they had been lobotomized. They had been given electric shock treatment on both sides of the head and lobotomized. I worked actually in the 1970s in a place called Good Mays, which is East London, and there was exactly the same thing. And it turned out within a sort of 7 or 8 mile radius, there were 4 of these institutions, all full to the brim with normal human beings who've been subjected to lobotomy. It's unbelievable. So, yeah. Anyway, shall I
Yeah.
continue?
Yeah, go ahead, carry on.
Dr. R.D. Laing, the infamous 1950s psychiatrist, started his career working in the mental hospitals of Glasgow, Scotland. Things were still bleak and violent, the treatment of schizophrenics brutal and frightening. He noticed the doctors rarely spoke to their patients, but instead medicated and isolated them. As an experiment, Laing took aside 12 women patients and talked to them about their lives. After 12 months, all 12 were well enough to leave the hospital, relieved of much of their torturous thinking simply by being listened to. Sadly, they were all back in the hospital within a year, and the experiment was deemed a failure by the establishment. But was it? Laing had proved that people diagnosed as insane could get better. No one knew why they had come in the first place, and no one knew why they had come back. reported Lang in a TV interview. So that shifted my focus of attention and research out into the actual circumstances where this thing called madness is incubated. Lang started to investigate the lives of these women, lives that were full of violence, sexual abuse, and trauma. Should I carry on, or would somebody like to take the Sigmund Freud? Take the
Cynthia, go
Sigmund-
ahead.
Thank you.
Sigmund Freud discovered.
Sigmund Freud had discovered the same thing 80 years
Oh.
earlier. Oh, was someone else going to go?
You're good, Elaine. Go for it.
Okay. All right. The lives of his first clients were also full of sexual abuse and trauma, but the elite of the Viennese society didn't want to hear it. After all, it was their wives and daughters that Freud was treating. Afraid of being ostracized, Freud soon dropped this unpopular discovery as an explanation for his patients' emotional suffering. Lang developed a theory that the doctors and nurses who were treating these patients were inadvertently returning them to the awful circumstances that had set them mad in the first place. Was it any wonder that they had found their way back into the hospital without the support or understanding they needed? Both Lang and Freud had highlighted something very important. And just to know, I highlighted this. What if their seemingly insane reaction to their unsafe home life was actually a justifiable, sane one?
Mhm.
Going on, also highlighted, if a partner or a child is beaten, abused, or raped, and no one is coming to save them, or no one is allowed to know, it is completely understandable to have a psychotic break from reality. With no other choice of escape, retreating into an alternative mental world where there was some possibility of control or relief was self-preservation. Maybe they weren't ill. Maybe they felt they had no alternatives. Maybe it was human resilience in action. I experienced a lot of violence in my early 20s, followed by 10 years of what today would be diagnosed as PTSD. I would scream at myself to shut up as I tried desperately to stop reliving the frightening events. Was I crazy? Or was it a very understandable response to a very frightening situation? I'm not
Well,
suggesting.
it's 1 minute before closing time here, so why don't we put a pin in it right there? Because
Okay.
I'd like to respect everybody's hour. And we'll start again next Wednesday at the same hour, an hour earlier, on page 6. And I'm not suggesting that everyone who's diagnosed. Okay? Feel free to pass this link along. The more the merrier, quote unquote. The ripples. I call it the ripples of understanding as they go out. So, and I just have a quick little anecdote before we hang up about the DSM. One of the stories I heard when I was researching about the development of that statistical manual was as they were sitting around that dining room table deciding if they want to, go out for Chinese food or whatever. They should we do this diagnosis or that diagnosis? There was one diagnosis that one of the heavy hitters said, "No, we can't put that in the manual." Why not? Because I do that.
And I'll add a
There-
little anecdote to that too. That's beautiful, Wendy. Thank you for that. And I wonder if Elaine had the same experience. When I was in school learning, and we had to take a course on diagnoses, and all of us said, "Oh my God, I've acted just like that. Maybe I have that." Whatever the
Right.
diagnosis was that we were studying, everybody said the same thing, because we live on a continuum and we go
Mhm,
through
mhm.
all those same experiences. And if nobody makes a big deal over it, it just passes.
Right.
Yes.
right.
And what I can add is what I used to do before I became a therapist is because of the childhood that I had in my family, I diagnosed my sisters, not necessarily with these kinds of diagnoses, but different kinds. I related them to certain songs and or people, you know, stories. So like my sister Tina, I considered her Sister Sledge. Okay, so because of her personality and the way that we got along, that was my diagnosis of her. Like she would act like Sister Sledge.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you, everyone. Don't hesitate to pass this along. I don't think there's going to be too many people in this conversation and too many people in this book group. So don't hesitate. And thank you very much. And I'll try to find a way to put it up on the screen so that people that don't have the book should be able to read it more easily.
Lovely.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.